So hopefully we'll get all this recorded, we'll see. Today we're going to talk about Buddhism from India to China and Japan. And we're only going to cover Chinese and Japanese architecture briefly because we'll cover them in more depth later. And in order to talk about Buddhism in India, we're going to start with Hinduism. Let's start with why we're doing this. And it's sort of like the philosophical question, who are we and what is the nature of the world in which we live? And what we want to see by the time we're done with this year is that different cultures have different answers to that question. That's why we study them. And when we get to second year, we're going to focus on a Western scientific materialist point of view. But before we get there, we want to see that there are quite a few others. So the point is that the answers are different in different cultures, which is why we study them. Today we're going to start with traditional Indian culture. Now at the end of today's talk, I'm going to talk about a notion called essentialism, which is a sort of a challenge to the point of view I'm presenting here, so you can understand that this point of view is not universally held. So let's start with Hindu architecture. To do that, we have to talk about India. And who knows why the Himalayan mountains are pressing up here? What's going on geographically? Anybody? Anybody from India? So the Indian subcontinent is crashing into Eurasia, pushing these up. So India is geographically kind of isolated. It has a lot of coastline, but it does not have good ports. And to the north are deserts and mountains. So India gets invaded, but maybe less than some other places. Now, I'm not going to spend enough time here for you to take down all these notes. These PowerPoint slides are available for you to download, so please download this and review it. But just a very quick overview background. So we begin with the first Neolithic settlements in 7000 BCE. So we talked about the Neolithic. What we spoke about is universal. So the kinds of cultures like Mohenjo-daro exist widely across the globe in that cultural period, including India. So in India, we then get the Indus Valley civilization, again, very much like Mohenjo-daro. It gets settled, it's parallel to the Neolithic civilizations in Mesopotamia and Egypt, and it gets, during the Vedic period, invaded by Indo-Europeans, who talked about them, constituting the end of the Neolithic period in a lot of areas of the world. Happens in India as well. And in the late Vedic period, we get Buddhism, which we'll be talking about. And between 200 BCE and 200 CE, a 400-year period, there's trade with the Roman Empire. So these ancient worlds were often pretty knowledgeable about each other. There were Buddhist temples in ancient Rome. So, you know, these worlds knew about each other. Under King Ashoka, great military ruler, and then regrets his military brutality and works to spread Buddhism later in his life. In the 10th century to the 16th century, you get Muslim invasions, which lead to the Mughal Empire. The best known representative architecturally of that is the Taj Mahal, that we'll be speaking about later when we talk about Islamic architecture. 18th century, you get European colonialism. In the 19th century, the British build a modern infrastructure in India, giving it a great advantage once it achieves independence. 1947, India gains independence and divides into India and Pakistan. So there on one slide is a 7,000-year history of India. So we just sort of have a contextual overview. So this Indus Valley civilization that dominates India in 3300 BC to 1300 BC, again, parallels what we've seen in other Neolithic periods. Its ruins are very much similar to them. It's over here at the Indus River, and there are a couple of prominent artifacts from that period. We see a priest king, so we see similarities to the culture of Mesopotamia in that sense. We have seals, we recall those from Mesopotamia, and this is a famous little sculpture of a dancing girl. So with 1500 BCE, we get the invasion of nomadic sheep-herding, light-skinned Indo-European or Aryan culture. They come out of the steppes of Russia. Remember we said last time about how the Neolithic period ends in many areas. These people have carts or war chariots, and they spread from the steppes of Russia all the way up into Scandinavia, all the way down into India. They're identified as Indo-Europeans as a language group. So when it's realized that Sanskrit is of the same language group as Latin, it's realized that this is one culture, and we understand when we see that gods like Zeus, Thor, and Indra are all the same. They're all father gods, thunder-wielding, lightning-wielding sky gods. So each of these cultures have a similar cultural deity. And heroic poetry or lyric songs. That's the Iliad and the Odyssey for the Greeks, but we're going to see that these other cultures have them as well. So Hindu culture begins as a melding of the earlier Dravidian Neolithic peoples and these invading light-skinned Aryan Indo-Europeans that then establish a caste system with themselves on top. And here is their war cart, and that's going to be the temple. This war cart is one of the symbolic origins of the Hindu temple that we'll be looking at. So the Hinduism that we'll be looking at is a combination of the earlier indigenous Dravidian culture and the superimposed Vedic traditions. So we're going to start with Hinduism, and then we'll get to Buddhism. And there's no one thing that Hinduism is. It is spread over an entire continent, over thousands of years of history. So it's a collection of diverse traditions, and it's very different in different cultural periods. Among its roots is Brahmanism, the Vedic invading tradition, which brings ritual sacrifice, texts, rulers putting the social order in accord with the cosmic order. Who can tell me what soma is? It's a hallucinogenic drug that the Vedic people bring. And we see its tradition in all of these cultures, and heroic gods. So ideas in Hinduism include attachment to Mother India. If you're a real Hindu, you do not leave India, because blood and soil are one integrated thing. The caste system, this world is an illusion. The real world is transcendent. And reincarnation, which depends on karma, and the definition of karma changes. It originally means conforming to the rules or the laws. Later it starts to mean doing good deeds. And you have to accumulate that to have better reincarnations. Now, I'm going to say several times during this course that a culture begins by laying down its temple form and its epic poem. So we'll see the temple form of India, and the epic poem, as it is the Iliad and the Odyssey for the Greeks, is the Mahabharata for India. Mahabharata is huge. It hasn't even been fully translated yet into European languages. It's 10 times as long as the Iliad and the Odyssey. Although we tend to focus on one section, the Bhagavad Gita. And the Bhagavad Gita tells the story of a prince whose kingdom is usurped, and he goes to do battle. Here are his armies, the opposing armies. He rides his chariots up and down between them and says, I see friends, teachers, mentors in both of these armies. This war should not be fought just for my ego. And then his charioteer, who is Vishnu, an avatar, who's Krishna, an avatar of Vishnu, appears in his horrific form, devouring in his tusks, ripping apart these armies, and he says, who do you think you are? These men are already dead. You do your duty, and your real concern is to conform to your role in this world and to be concerned with your reincarnations, which will come about properly if you conform to your role in this world. So, wonderful reading, something you might dip into, and containing a lot of the sort of psychological basis of Indian culture. Now we get to the temple and we start with a mandala. So what is a mandala? So a mandala is a geometric diagram with a series of concentric circles and squares. So that's it descriptively, but then its meaning, it's the plan of a palace. So we've got walls and 4 gates, as would a palace or a city. It's a model of the cosmos. It's a model of the mind, and it's a tool that we use to meditate upon, to put the mind in harmony with the cosmos. So it's a tool for meditation, for bringing your mind into the proper harmonic order. So a Hindu temple is a 3-dimensional mandala. And put it almost another way, a mandala is a 2-dimensional Hindu temple, because it's really the plan of a sacred palace. Now, before we go to our key example, let me just start with Khajuraho, which is covered with erotic sculpture. And so what's going on here? And what we have here is a notion of the birth of reality. So you start with, well, in the beginning must have been oneness. But if there's only one, there can't be anything, because one can only exist in relationship to something else. And so this oneness becomes lonely and splits to create duality. And now there are 2 things, and there can then be perception. There's something to perceive. So you can have a sense of self and a sense of other. And this duality becomes male and female. The female delta genitals, the male erect genitals, and these 2 come into a dynamic relationship with each other. They are the generation of all of reality. And remember, we saw those symbols even in the Paleolithic, and you'll find these elements already there in those Paleolithic symbols. And so the Sri Yantra here, which we're looking at, is these interposed upward triangles and downward triangles. This relationship between duality, and then the Bindu is this point in the center, which is the origin of all things. And so putting it in erotic terms, a couple is in embrace and experiencing oneness and no awareness of anything else. And then pulling apart, oh my God, there's somebody else here. And then, if you recall how women are the troublemakers, so in Pandora's box, Pandora opens a box and lets out all the troubles of the world. In the story of the Garden of Eden, Eve gets them thrown out of the garden. And the way women do this is by giving birth. So once you give birth, you have life. Once you have life, you're going to have death. So we're now in the cycle of birth and death, in the cycle of life. So this architecture is a way of understanding and embodying and engaging one with how out of transcendent oneness comes our phenomenal world. Now, a little bit about a Hindu psychological system, and it's called the chakra system, and there are 7 chakras going up the spine, and these are energy centers. And each one is of a different nature. So at the very base of the spine, there's one of pure power. At the genitals, it's one of pleasure. At the abdomen, it's one of power. At the heart, it's one of culture. And then at the throat, there's one of spiritual potential. At the third eye is the notion of God with form. And at the top of the skull, the top 7th chakra, is God without form. So these are psychological levels. And some traditions have you going up and to the highest level, and some say a healthy circumstance is to circulate among these, that you want to be able to navigate through all of them. And these are integrated with the outside world. So the energy of the self is interpenetrated with circulating energies of the world. And then these traditions in India, and we're going to see also in China, is to put one in harmony with those cycles of energy. Now, this is integrated into the whole workings of the cosmos and everyday life. So if you put sand on the surface of a drum, and then you bong a tuning fork and put it on that drum, the vibrations will organize the sand into patterns like these Hindu patterns. And so this tells them that the universe is driven by sound, and that these sounds have a harmonic quality. Here is a traditional Hindu woman who every morning out of flour makes this mandala in front of her house, and then during the course of the day, insects and rodents come and eat the flour, and so that its spiritual power is integrated into everyday life. And in some Hindu countries, and for example in Bali, you get on a bus, the bus driver will have folded a banana leaf, put water in it, and put a flower in it. So you're greeted by that just getting on the bus. Anybody ever encounter that in a New York bus? So there's this sense of bringing this into everyday life. It's not something that you just do on the weekend. So, Hinduism. Takeaway, summary slide. So be sure when you download this PowerPoint that you bring into your notes each of these items, and that you know them for the exam. It's integrated into everyday life. Attachment to Mother India, a caste system. This world is illusion, and the real world is transcendent. Reincarnation, which depends on karma, which is seen as conforming to the rules. So a lot of what happens in Hinduism and Buddhism is a unquestioned belief in reincarnation. This life is not it. There are a lot of implications to that. For example, if you're miserable in this life, death isn't going to help, because you're just going to come back and be miserable. You got to get it fixed. And so your many incarnations are opportunities to put things in proper order. So this then gets manifest in the Hindu temple. And here's Lingaraja temple. So the Hindu temple is a manifestation in form of the Hindu or Indian worldview. So, for example, a pyramidal caste system, it's a three-dimensional mandala. Its purpose is to put one in harmony with the world. Now, unlike a Christian church, you don't gather big crowds there to hear a sermon. We have individual worship. You go there personally to make an offering, to bring yourself into this harmony. It's a cart or chariot of the spirit. We'll see that in a minute. It's a model of the Hindu caste system, and it's a model of Hindu worldviews of yantras and mandalas. A yantra is a form of mandala. So here is the Vastapurusha mandala, and it's a man imposed into a square. So it's a 9 square with more squares in the outer perimeter. So this Vastapurusha is a wild man, chaotic, uncontrolled, and the cultural system brings order, brings him under control. Fear of wildness. In our culture today, we're looking for a little more wildness. We want to free the creative imagination. These cultures are doing the opposite. They are highly conformist and putting one into a conformity with the system. And the central and highest part of the self is in the dantian, or the belly. So we would say, well, if there is a spirit, it's probably in the brain. They see it in the belly. And then the lower parts of the body, the arms and legs that do the work. Now this is also symbolic of the lower castes that do the work and the higher castes that have spiritual achievement. This is then translated into diagrams which become the temple. So the temple is a three-dimensional mandala. So here's the Lingaraja temple, and looking at this, you might first be struck by, wait a minute, these walls are not lining up with the points on the grid. They're not supposed to, because at those points is where energy travels, and you don't want to be blocking the energy. Now, what I'm showing you here is not speculative. There are ashrams in India to this day that teach this material. The text still exists, it's still taught. Not a lot of people are interested in it, but just like some people in Christianity might become monks, or in Judaism might become rabbis, there are some people in India who dedicate themselves to this historical tradition. Now, to build one of these temples, now this is really interesting because in a couple of weeks, Anthony Caradona is going to give us a lecture about Rome, and he's going to begin with the Etruscans. The Etruscans are the people out of whom the Romans grow, and the Etruscans have a ceremony for how they lay out their cities that is exactly the same as what I'm going to describe, because it comes from the same Indo-European people. So you want to lay out a sacred city, a sacred temple city, as we see here. And you begin by choosing an auspicious day. You have astrologers do that. And then you establish a gnomon, a central point, draw a circle around that. And then if you go through a sunrise and sunset, you can get your east-west axis, east-west and then north-south axis. That's not hard to do. Someone says, oh my God, the pyramids are lined up exactly north-south. Wow. Well, any Boy Scout can do that with a circle and a stick if you go through the shadows of a day. You then stake out a mandala, level the site, and then you make offerings and ablutions on the site, put grains, sacrifices, milks, cheeses, and then you plow that under, sow seeds, have animals come and eat the crop, plow that under again, and then lay out your diagram for the sacred city. Then you might repeat that to the central temple. So it's going to be interesting when we look at when we look at the Etruscans and see how they do this. So I said one of the symbols that was represented by a Hindu temple is that it's a cart or chariot. So here is a temple at Katsura, and there are two parts, the male lingam or phallus tower and the womb cavern, female womb cavern. In this case, this tower has fallen down, but look right here, here are the horses. The whole temple is one of these cart chariots. A chariot of the sun. When we get to Versailles in France, we're going to find out that Louis XIV was the Sun King. And we're going to find Apollo's chariot an important symbol, and that the whole of Versailles is a chariot, and the stables are lined up to be symbolic of the horses. So this is, these symbols are just go throughout history. The funerals for these Indo-European kings, when Jackie Kennedy arranged John F. Kennedy's funeral, when the president was assassinated, she took down the books from the library to read exactly how Lincoln's funeral was done, which was exactly this pattern. You have the cart, you have the horses, the stirrups turned to the rear for the dead king, and so that tradition is with us to this day from thousands of years ago. So the Hindu temple, it's a three-dimensional mandala. It's a model of, it's a representation in form of the Indian worldview or system. It's a model of the cosmos, a model of the mind, and a tool for putting one in accord with the cosmos. So if you're a Hindu and you're in one of these temples, you go to the compound, you'll be in a garden. It should be quiet. There may be one or two other people there, but you will have these vibrational feelings that are putting you in accord with your mind in the way it should be. It's used in individual worship. It's a symbol of a cart or chariot of the spirit. It's a model of the Hindu caste system, and it harmonizes mind, space, sound, and energy. So, architecture is the manifestation of a culture in form. And this is our key example. So, a couple of peripheral cultures. Angkor Wat. So we go off to Indochina, Cambodia, and this culture has spread. And here in Kampuchea, or Cambodia, a capital of Surveyamon II, the Khmer kingdom in the 12th century AD, it displays Hindu and Buddhist traditions, and architecturally it has stone corbel vaulting. So we get these vast complexes. These are temple complexes, probably occupied only by priests and monks or nuns. And the Khmer kings were regarded as incarnations of a deity like Shiva, Vishnu, or Laksharva, to whom the well-being of the realm was confined. So this notion that the king has to be healthy for the kingdom to be healthy. Exactly the idea that we saw in Egypt, where King Zoser would run his race every 20 years in the Hebshed festival to show that he's healthy and vital, so the kingdom shall be vital. Now, mythologically, these are based on a myth of the churning of the Sea of Milk. So the Sea of Milk is chaos. There's a lot of concern with how to get order out of chaos. And if you take cream and you churn it, you have, in the old days, a barrel, you put the cream in it, and you have a churning stick go back and forth, you'll turn it into butter. So the churning of the sea of milk is the bringing of order into chaos. And so, seeing the need for this, the gods, who look like the Indo-Europeans, and the devils, who look like the Dravidians, get together and cooperate. And they get a giant serpent. And Vishnu volunteers as the churning stick, and they wrap the serpent around him and pull back and forth, and churn this sea of chaos to bring about order. And so this is a phallic symbol, and also the churning stick that brings order into chaos. And so sculptures of this and murals of this are throughout Angkor Wat. During the middle of this process, a deadly poison, a blue smoke poison, comes out and will kill anything, including gods. And Vishnu captures it and holds it suspended in his throat, which is why in some manifestations Vishnu is blue. Now we're also interested in this complex. It continues to be studied to this day. And if you go to Indochina, how many people, anybody seen this? Fantastic. Go to Indochina, it's something you want on your list. But one of the things we're interested in today is how, obviously there was a reasonably large population to build this kind of thing. What sustained them? And it looks like we have this kind of a swamp agriculture where we can capture the nutrients from this tropical rainforest rotting jungle and use it as fertilizer in these rice paddies. And they're beginning to be able to detect the ground arrangements for this agriculture. Now, this is one more UNESCO World Heritage Site. They put up the money, and then the tourism helped support the local economy. And when they got there, roots had grown through the whole thing, knocked over the stones, very aggressive jungle or tropical rainforest, and all that has to be cleared away. And if you stop maintaining it, it'll come back very quickly. Here we see an example of the corbel vault, and we get to Rome, we'll talk about the difference between a corbel vault and a true vault. So the true vault is developed by the Romans. There were examples earlier, but we very clearly associate it with Rome. In a corbel vault, the stones come in, and then you hope they don't fall down. And then architects just love the plans of these things. It's just the rich geometry of them. If you get a book by Stearlin called Encyclopedia of World Architecture, it has these incredible plans. You should be able to pick up a good used copy. Two books you want to own: Stearlin's Encyclopedia of World Architecture and Bannister Fletcher, A History of Architecture on the Comparative Method. And you don't want to read either of them. You just want the incredible drawings. So now we'll talk about Buddhism. Law of the Awakened One, Buddha is awakened. And it's very tricky to say what Buddhism is. You would say, okay, it's one of the world's great religions. But some years ago, we had a Saudi prince as a student, and he was a little bit of a party animal. So Brent Porter, my late wife, and I managed to get him through the curriculum. And his mother came over from Paris and had a dinner for us to, just sort of thank us. And we're talking, she says, well, what's your religion? So my late wife and I say, well, we're Buddhists. She says, Buddhism is not a religion. Christianity, Judaism, Islam are religions. You have to have a religion. So is Buddhism a religion, or is it a practical psychology, or a philosophy? You can debate that. But from certain points of view, Buddha is not a god. Buddha is a human being who figured it out. And anybody can figure it out and therefore be a Buddha. So, but anyway, a lot of theology there, but just to introduce that idea. So there's a real figure, Siddhartha Gautama, mid-6th century, and he, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but in these religions, when you get the story, like the story of Christ, who knows if any of that's true? that there was a manger and this and that. But the point is, that story embeds the position of the religion. And so the story of the Buddha embeds the notion of Buddhism. So he's a prince, his father's been told there's a chance he might want to be a religious leader. That's not good, because then he won't take over running the kingdom. And so his father protects him from seeing any of the realities of the world, surrounds him with worldly pleasures, and the gods conspire that the young prince shall go out and see in 3 trips old age, sickness, and death. And he says to his teachers, "What's that?" Because he's never seen any of that in his protected palace. And he said, "Well, that's the human condition." So, "Well, that's no good. I got to fix that." And so, if you go through the details of the story, it sort of, unfolds the ideas of Buddhism. But we don't have time for that. But Buddhism spreads throughout India in the 500 years after Buddha's death and becomes a dominant religion in this area. Today, Buddhism is gone in India. There's some of it into China, and it's also spread throughout the world in various ways. The only Buddhism in India today are Tibetan refugees. So today there are 3 major Buddhist traditions. Theravada is monastic Buddhism. So when you see documentaries about Indochina, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, with their saffron robes, that's Theravadic Buddhism. It's monastic Buddhism. You become a monk in order or none in order to work on your getting better reincarnations. And if you are busy in the world of commerce, you say, well, in the next incarnation, I'll have time to work. In the meantime, I'll do good deeds by making donations to the monastery. In Mahayana Buddhism, everybody can be working on improving themselves. Zen Buddhism is a form of Mahayana. So washing the dishes can be a form of meditation. So right livelihood, everything you do in your life can be dedicated toward putting yourself into this state you want to be in. And it's you have the notion of the bodhisattva, who's a figure who takes a vow to say, I will not achieve nirvana, death without rebirth, until all sentient beings have achieved nirvana. So nirvana is the goal. We've got these continuous recycles of life. All life is suffering, and so you want to escape that. Death without rebirth, which can either be oblivion or a unification with transcendent oneness in different traditions, is the goal. And the Bodhisattva says, I will not do that until I've helped everybody do it. Vajrayana Buddhism is a form of Mahayana in Tibet where you can do it in one lifetime. Very high-powered, dangerous techniques. And so here's a Zen warrior, an example of Mahayana, and the Dalai Lama of Tibet is in the Vajrayana tradition. And Buddhism can be a popular everyday culture. You can put a little, statuette on the mantelpiece, and that's your practice. Or it can be very sophisticated theological, philosophical positions. This is a book about parallels in Buddhism to quantum theory and post-structuralism. Now, there are 2 types of religion, ethnic religions and world religions. So an ethnic religion is for a particular group. You are born Jewish, Hindu, or Shinto. If you're born Japanese, you're Shinto. That's it's that tradition. You don't convert to these things. Occasionally, if you marry somebody, you might convert. But generally, you don't convert to these religions. A world religion is for everyone. Christianity, Buddhism, and Islam are world religions. They started somewhere, but they're now everywhere in the world. So Buddhism is a world religion. And I'm going to, again, not pause on the slide, but just very generally, and some people might object to this, so just take it as a metaphor. You might say that Christianity generalizes Judaism to make it universally available. In that sense, Buddhism generalizes Hinduism to make it universally available. And whereas in Hinduism, you obey the rules and have rituals, in Buddhism, you are concerned about your inner state and bringing it into a harmony with the cosmos. So, again, I'm not going to pause for this, but I had fun of making up this little diagram comparing Buddhism, Christianity, and materialism. So, in Christianity, the cosmos is consistent of God, human, and nature. There's three things. They're metaphysically different. In materialism, the cosmos is space, time, and matter. And consciousness is not real, it's emergent. It's what happens when neurons fire. There is no consciousness. We just think we have consciousness. In Buddhism, the cosmos is made of the interrelated consciousness of all beings. So again, I'm not going to go through this whole thing. Download the slide, see if you agree with it. One more. The soul, I put it in quotes because that's not really a Buddhist concept, is eternal and continually reincarnates. In Christianity, the soul makes a one-way trip. And I think that plays a role in a very dynamic sense of time in the Western world. In materialism, there is no soul, just the firing of neurons. So, 1 minute Buddhism. The Buddhist teachings begin with what's called the Four Noble Truths. All life is suffering. Death is not a solution due to reincarnation. You say, well, I'm not suffering right now. Well, actually, I guess we are. We're stuck in a 2-hour lecture. But, sometimes I'm not suffering. Yeah, but then you will. You say, well, what about when I eat chocolate cake? Yeah, but then what happens after? So, even when you can escape suffering, it's going to come back. So then, second noble truth, suffering is caused by desire, fear, and ignorance, or passion, aggression, ignorance. And there's a way out of that suffering, and the way out of that suffering is the teachings of the Buddha. So, our architectural example, Buddhist Stupa. So, we're going to look at two examples. First one will be the Great Stupa at Sanchi, which is what we're seeing here. We'll get to how to write that down in a minute. And so what is a stupa? Okay, first of all, it's a reliquary. Can anybody tell me what a relic is? It's a little bit gross. A relic is a piece of a dead saint. So you go into a church and there'll be a little box and we say, we have Saint so-and-so's finger. And it has healing powers. So Chartres Cathedral, for example, has Mary's robe that she wore at the time of the crucifixion, they say. So this has great healing powers or spiritual powers, and if you make a pilgrimage to the sites that have these relics, you will be enriched. You circumambulate it, has no interior, so you walk around it counterclockwise. And it illustrates the life and teachings of the Buddha. We'll see murals on Borobudur. It's again, a three-dimensional mandala. And it's therefore a means of putting oneself in harmony with the cosmos. So, The levels of the stupa represent the levels of consciousness in Buddhism. There's the world of desire, the world of form, the formless world, and the void. So there are these different stages or states. And the great stupa of Sanchi is our example. So the Emperor Ashoka commissioned many stupas around India. And the stupa can take many forms as Buddhism goes from India to other countries. For example, combines with the Chinese watchtower to become the pagoda. So here are different kinds of stupas in different parts of Asia. And the key one we'll look at is Borobudur. Borobudur is in what's today Indonesia, in the island of Java, in a great plain surrounded by volcanic mountains. So it's very spiritually, very powerful area. And unfortunately, therefore, it's made out of volcanic rock, which is very porous. So it's not a high quality rock, so it holds dirt. And it suffers a lot of earthquakes because it's a volcanic region. And this is, again, a restoration by UNESCO. What do we have here? Stepped pyramid, stairs on 4 sides, temple on the top. Something to think about. Go see more examples of that. And these are representative of the layers of the world of desire, form, formless world, and void. Now, remember I pointed out that the pyramid was not square? There's a little dent in it, the Great Pyramid. So when you look at drawings, it's going to show this as round. And somebody was too lazy to draw it right. It's slightly flattened on each of the 4 sides. It's not really round. And so you go up the stairs, walk all the way around, go up another layer, and walk all the way around. And as you're walking around, there are murals of stories of the life of the Buddha. Here is Buddha's mother going to a sacred spot to give birth to the Buddha. And this informs the illiterate of the stories of their tradition, because most people in the world do not read until modern times, just as the sculptures in stained glass of the Gothic cathedral tell the stories of the Christian Bible. And here is a plan of Borobudur, and here is a mandala. So you can see this is a 3-dimensional mandala. So the Buddhist Stupa, it's a reliquary, it's a pilgrimage destination, you circumambulate it, no interior, and it illustrates the life and teachings of the Buddha. And the meanings, it's to help you in meditation, which is watching and taming the mind. It's a mandala, or a tool for meditation. And again, a model of the cosmos, a model of mind, and putting the two in harmony, and it's a 3-dimensional mandala. Now, I just want to end this section with 2 of my favorite sculptures. So, we're going to look next semester at the Renaissance. We'll see Michelangelo's David. And let's take that as a representative sculpture of Western culture, of Renaissance and Western humanism. The human being as anatomical, having a body, and then look at Prajna Paramita, goddess of transcendent wisdom. This sculpture's from East Java, 1300. Female body in meditation. And so here there is an inner psychological self. And here there is an attempt to transcend, move beyond, get away from one's ego self, to come in touch with something transcendent. So, two very different traditions. Japanese architecture becomes particularly important to us in details of construction because it's very influential on the pioneering modern architects. So what I'm going to do today is just look at the spread of Buddhism into China and Japan, and very briefly look at the architecture. And then we're going to see it much more detail next semester. So looking at China, again, we have a Neolithic period beginning around 7000 BCE on the Yellow River. And we have a long history of China that we're not going to talk about right now. We're just going to talk about some symbolic ideas. But in Chinese history of alternating periods of unity and disunity, and occasionally China becomes dominated by steppes people who invade, who then become absorbed. Now, one of the things I'm going to mention is in Chinese architecture, in the layout of cities and houses, the hostility of the north and the beneficence of the south. So the north is where it's mountainous, cold, and invaders come from, and the south is rich and fertile, as we see in this geographical slide. So you have a vast country formed like a series of terraces from the Tibetan and Himalayas and the Mongolian steppes to the west and north, and then down to these fertile valleys. So north is negative, south is positive. And in terms of relationship to nature, consider the dragon. Now, we might say the dragon is a creature of the Mother Earth figure that we saw in the Neolithic period and is symbolic of earth energies. And in the West, we slay the dragon. The adolescent male hero slays the dragon, rescues the maiden, who is the female is now subjugated. And in Chinese tradition, the dragon is beneficent. It is celebrated. It is very much a part of the culture. And we could take that as a symbolic of a deep-seated desire to live in harmony with nature rather than to conquer nature. And that in part's going to be perhaps why Western science takes off and Chinese science does not. China sees science as integral, traditional China sees science as integral with its culture. The West separates it so that it can see it exploitively. We're going to see the principle of geomancy and use two terms here, geomancy, which is earth divination, or Feng Shui, which means wind and water. The notion of that there are energy currents flowing through the earth, and your architecture and planning, where you put your city, how you orient it, where you put your building, how you orient it, should be in harmony and work with those energies. So in locating a building, laying out a building, besides an architect, you'll call in a geomancer. And the geomancer, now today we're familiar with geomancy as sort of common sense things like face your bedroom this way or face your door that way, but it's really quite involved theoretical discipline in traditional China. This is a geomancer's tool with all of these symbolic notations, a compass in the center, and this is a geomancer's map of energies he has detected and their motion. On top, we see a Chinese medical diagram. And how many people have had a treatment of acupuncture? Okay. So the theory of acupuncture is, theory of Chinese medicine is, that you have flowing through you a whole series of energies. And in fact, diagnosis is done of the 5 pulses, liver, spleen, lungs, heart, etc., on the 2 wrists. And these all have energies flowing through you. If an energy is not flowing properly, is blocked, then the acupuncture needle will unblock the natural flow of that energy and restore it to its proper natural state. That's a theory of acupuncture. That's the theory of geomancy with your buildings. Your buildings are like acupuncture into the earth. And if you have bad energies flowing and you put your building right in the path of those bad energies, bad things will happen to its occupants. And so you want your building to work properly with the beneficial flows of energy. And so this is an unfair pairing that I've made, but it'll make the point. This is the most famous Western painting, Mona Lisa, by Leonardo da Vinci. And it's pretty obvious where the human being is. The human individual dominates the scene, and the landscape is miniaturized into the background. Here is a Chinese painting. There are people here, but we don't notice them right away. Besides the fact they're small, the quality of the brush strokes for the people is the same as, say, for the roots of the tree. They do not metaphysically pop. They are integral with a part of nature. There's architecture up here. Again, we don't notice it. It doesn't metaphysically pop. We don't notice it right away. So in the Chinese tradition, there is a working with respect for an integration with the landscape rather than a domination of it that we see in the West. Now we're going to look at a couple of traditions that will underlie Chinese culture and therefore thought. And one of them is Taoism, spelled with a T but pronounced with a D. And right away, if anybody here is familiar with Taoism, you should be aware that it can mean a lot of things. There's popular Taoist traditions, which has magical potions, etc. And then there's a sort of a sophisticated Taoist philosophy. And so they are related, but not really the same thing. So we're going to look at the Tao Te Ching by a legendary figure, Lao Tzu. And the Tao means the way, the workings of nature, or the workings of all things. And Taoism influences the naturalness and spontaneity of Chinese landscape architecture, painting, and Chinese architecture. This is a depiction of Lao Tzu. So the Tao Te Ching begins, now let me back up. Chinese is very different from English, so that there's almost an infinite number of different ways you can translate something into English, many layers of subtle metaphorical meaning, etc. My favorite translation of the Tao Te Ching is by Feng in English. Beautiful, beautiful translation. And it begins, the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. In other words, the Tao, the principle behind all things, transcends concepts. And then we say, the nameless is the beginning of heaven and earth. The named is the mother of the 10,000 things. So there are two different things. There is transcendence and there's material manifestations. Ever desireless, one can see the transcendence or the mystery. Ever desiring, one can see the manifestations. But the two are the same thing. These two states are ultimately the same. So, a lot of mystical thought just compacted into the opening page of the Tao Te Ching. The Tao comes before manifestation. It's the principle lying beyond all things, the state of being unborn. You can approach the Tao only indirectly, only through poetic metaphor. Empty yourself of everything, let the mind become still, and then it'll become apparent. If you rationally try to figure it out, it won't work. And the Tao becomes before morality, so that when people get into kindness and morality and rules and how good they are, that means they're not good. There's something called Taoist inaction. Instead of making things happen, you let things happen, yield and overcome. And that's what you're studying with your body when you study Tai Chi. So Tai Chi is the study of Taoist principles with your body. And we cannot control nature. We can only work harmoniously with it. So, do you think you can take over the universe and improve it? I do not believe it can be done. The universe is sacred. You cannot improve it. If you try to change it, you will ruin it. Very different attitude than the Western attitude toward understanding and control of nature. And the principle of yin and yang. So all of manifestations, all of the manifest world, the world of desiring as opposed to desireless, is experienced in duality. Hot, cold, fire, water, restless, at rest, etc. But these dualities are interpenetrating each other, and there's a little bit of one in the other. So there isn't good and evil as opposite things, but as a continuity and interpenetration. Now, Buddhism comes into China, and we looked at Buddhism just last hour, and architecturally, the Buddhist Stupa and the indigenous Chinese watchtower come together to give the pagoda. But when we talked about Buddhism, I didn't mention anything about nature, about putting oneself in harmony with nature. And we don't really see that thinking in Buddhism until it comes into China and Japan. So this Taoism, this appreciation of the workings of the universe and the principles and workings of nature, when Buddhism comes into China, these things become merged. And we now think in terms of working with nature as opposed to in opposition to it. Now, another important principle of China is a sense of isolation. There's a story of when the British are finally able to make fine china. Wedgwood is able to manifest something that had been mastered in China. I said fine china, I mean fine ceramics, the chinaware in dishes. And it's called china because the high quality ceramics to make chinaware is mastered in China. And when the British are able to do it, and the Chinese ambassador brings a gift from the king to the King of England to the Chinese emperor, he refuses it. He said, "Why would I want your stuff? We make the best." So he won't even look at it because of this self-centered belief that they are the center of all things. So the Chinese vision of the universe is at the center is the imperial center. And that's surrounded by the royal domains, and then the tributary feudal princes, and then the zone of pacification. Those are the people we've stomped. And then the zone of allied barbarians. Those are people we haven't stomped, but they'll side with us in a fight. And then finally, the zone of culturalist savagery. That's the West. And so there's this very concentric view that sees China as the center of the universe. Something that Europe didn't really have. The Europeans said, let's go see what's out there. You know, maybe there's a lot of gold in South America, and we can steal it. Characteristics of Chinese buildings, Asian buildings in general. We have, first, rammed earth podium. Then, columns with stone bases, elaborate structural systems for the roof, and then roofing of tile or thatch, and then non-bearing, non-structural infill walls between the bearing columns. And this is going to become very exciting to the modern architects when they see this in same principles in Japan. And so we'll look next year in more detail at this, but here's the Forbidden City, Imperial capital in Beijing. And here we see the moat being our walls, 4 gates. And notice how we're putting our back up to the north and then open up to courtyards to the south. And the earth from digging the moat is then dumped up here to make an artificial mountain symbolic of the mountains to the north. So the configuration of the Forbidden City and an individual dwelling is in this pattern. So, again, we'll go into some detail on how this is constructed next year. So our takeaway for China: integration with nature, relation of opposites, flow with nature, and an insular concentric world. So Buddhism comes into China, but then mixes with this Taoist tradition to become much more interested in nature. And now, again, very briefly, traditional Japanese culture and architecture. So our indigenous spiritual tradition in Japan is Shinto. It's the indigenous ethnic religion of Japan. And again, you are Shinto by way of being born. Very famously, when the United States occupied Japan at the end of World War II, first thing you do when you occupy somebody is you take a census. You want to know who's here. What do we have here? And so the occupying governor of Japan was General MacArthur. And the census showed when you added up the Buddhists, Christians, and Shintos, it was more than the number of people in Japan, because many people are 2 or 3 of those. You're born, you're Shinto. When you get married, you might be Christian. And when you're dying, you become Buddhist, because Buddhism negotiates into an afterlife. It's a nature-based religion, and there's a veneration of kami, or spirit, of places. So this, somebody says, you know, this tree seems to be very spiritually powerful. So you mark it with this rope, put a little fence around it so no one will litter, and you just marked a spiritually powerful spot. And spirit is in materials, so that wood will have spirit. And you want to build in a way that that spirit can express itself. When you have a wooden main column in a Japanese residence, you do not put it through a sawmill, make it an 8x8, and then paint it, because that will seal in the spirit. You take a tree trunk carefully, select it to have just a nice camber to it, peel off the bark, and let the spirit, and evident in the grain of the wood, radiate into the room and enrich the space and enrich you. So spirit is in all things and radiates into the environment. So in the biblical tradition, there's God, man, and nature, 3 metaphysically different things. In the Shinto tradition, the human being is a natural animal, and spirit is in all things. So spirit, human, and nature are one integrated thing, not 3 separate things. So again, in Japan, we'll see the same principles of rammed earth podium, stone, column, non-structural infill wall, and elaborate roof. And we have a very strong tradition in Japan of detailing. So the aside from they won't engage in fair trade, one of the reasons the Japanese don't buy American cars is lousy fit and finish. So the Japanese are very poor, they have very limited physical material possessions, their apartments are tiny, but what they have is excellent. And so they're very proud of a beautiful automobile, perfect fit and finish. The doors are totally flush with the panels, etc. And an American car comes over, there's a half-inch space between the door and the front fender panel. I said, what is that? So here we see some woodwork displaying this. This bracket system becomes ornamental, and the beautiful display of detailing in the woodwork, which you'll see, for example, in a sushi chef at a sushi bar, cutting up the vegetables, cutting up the fish into these excellently detailed craftsmanship. So our spiritually marked spot, well, maybe we'll put a little temple here so that when we make offerings to the spirits, leave some food, it'll be sheltered. And then the most important example of that is Ise Shrine, sometimes referred to as the Parthenon of Japan, the most important building. Now, tricky thing going on here. The date for this is 3rd century CE or AD. This looks in pretty good shape for something wood thing that's 2,000 years old, but the trick is it's rebuilt every 20 years. Now, I'm not going to go through this. Look at the slide when you download it. But there are two temples, main temples in the shrine, and one has the royal paraphernalia, what in Britain they call the crown jewels. So here it is. They build it. They do not finish the wood. They leave out that stone to protect it from moisture coming up. They do let the moisture come up into the wood, helps it age and rot. Here we see green mold growing into the roof. And this will then be rebuilt every 20 years and this torn down. In 20 years from now, we'll build it over here and tear this one down. So that's why it's in great shape after 20 years. And here we see it's been recently rebuilt. The wood is very fresh. And we see pegs used, there's no nails, use pegs in the joinery, and those are exaggerated to produce the ornament. You see here. So these are ornamentally exaggerated. And again, we'll go into this, Donald Cromley will go into this in detail next year. Okay, now in Japan, as in China, there are many, many schools of Buddhism. Most famous one is Zen Buddhism, comes from China, where it's called Chinang Buddhism. It's imported as a reform movement. Anything that's around long enough is probably going to get corrupt, as we see in government in the United States today, which is all about, hijacking all the money. And so what's supposed to be a spiritual discipline becomes, the abbot accumulating great wealth. So then you get reform movements, you get reform schools that return to the original simplicity that was originally intended. So Zen is one of those. And in Zen Buddhism, there's no theology, you don't write books, you just sit in meditation, and the abbot comes by and occasionally swats you in the back of the head with a 2x4, and you say, what was that for? And you got to figure it out. And you're tested with what's called Zen koans. So a very famous koan is, what's the most famous koan? Anybody? What is the sound of one hand clapping? And the point is you can't figure it out. It comes to you when you're ready. It's not arrived at through logic. It's an anti-logic system. So this school becomes favored by artists and samurai warriors. Now, interestingly, Buddhism is supposed to be pacifist. You're not even supposed to kill an animal to eat it. You're supposed to be a vegetarian. How can you be a warrior and be a Buddhist? Well, you only kill your opponent when it was exactly what he needed for his next incarnation. So, interesting ideas. And Zen encourages simplicity, humility, asymmetry in Japanese architecture. Appreciation of the essence of things. So now we take this notion of essences, which, you know, we might have in India as well, but now we combine it with an interest in nature and become very interested in these materials like wood. And spontaneity in the arts. So a Zen calligrapher artist might zip, 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 make a painting just in a few seconds. So our key example illustrating this, and again we'll look at it in detail next semester, is Katsura Imperial Villa, built for a, in effect, retired nobleman to contemplate, poetically contemplate nature and poetry. So we see it's asymmetrical, integrated with the nature of its site, interpenetrating inside and outside. So we have our columns in a grid, but not a regular grid. And the walls slide open. And even when they're closed, many of them are panels of rice paper, so that there's a lot of interpenetration between inside and outside. Here we are integrated with nature. And here we are on a deck where we can contemplate the reflection of the moon and recite or compose haiku poetry. So haiku is a form of poetry in 17 syllables. Famous example, old pond, a frog leaps in, water's sound. So very contemplative, very sensitive. So here's our rammed earth podium, our stone, our column, our non-structural infill wall, and our thatched or tile roof. And see here this crushed rock. Anybody know what that's for? There's no rain gutter here, so the rain's going to come off the roof straight down and chop up the earth, so this protects it. And then, if you're supposed to walk looking down, the rocks, these stepping stones will be smooth. If you're, will be rough and irregular, so you got to look down to see them. Or if they're smooth and continuous, then you can look up. And so the architect or landscape architecture controls your view or experience of the nature. So just a little interesting aside, there are strong similarities between these two traditions. But if we look at the Hall of Harmony in the Forbidden City, where the throne room is, see lots of ornament, gilding, paint, and here also a royal dwelling. No gilding, no ornament, no paint, all just the plain natural materials. Go to a Chinese restaurant, your teacup might look like this, glazed, covered with ornament. In a Japanese restaurant, it might look like that, where we just see the natural clay and the process whereby it was made. As the cup is turning on the potter's wheel, the fingers dragging across it, making these indentations, and then just glazed on the inside to keep the tea from soaking into the ceramic, but not on the outside, so you can feel the natural, unornamented ceramic. So think about these different cultures as they reflect to us today. So here's Katsura Imperial Villa, integrated with its landscape. Here's a building we'll see next year, Villa Rotunda, a Renaissance building in Italy, dominating its landscape, putting the human being in the center, dominating the landscape rather than integrated with the landscape and interpenetrating inside and outside. So now, here's something to think about. There's Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water. Which one of these other two, the Renaissance Italian or the 16th century Japanese, 17th century Japanese, is it more similar to? Something for you to think about. So now, we'll wrap up with something called the Needham Question. Why are these cultures so important? So, Joseph Needham was an English physician, just died a few years ago, lived to be 95, and got interested in China. He was at Cambridge University and spent many years in China studying Chinese technology. And so we become aware that early inventions in China included the abacus, the shadow clock, flying. They were flying in 300 AD in giant kites. And four great inventions of ancient China: the compass, gunpowder, paper making, printing with movable type, hundreds of years before the Europeans. So the Needham Question is, China was well in advance of Europe, wealth, size, technology, until the 1400s, when Europe took off and China stagnated. Why? So that's the Needham Question. And evidence of that, in the 1400s, Admiral He set out in a series of expeditions with up to 300 ships, a dozen giant treasure ships, triple hulled, the size of several football fields, 15 times the tonnage of Columbus's ships, 9 masts, traveling throughout Eurasia. Some speculate he got to the Americas, until the emperor discovered what was going on, destroyed the ships, and destroyed as many records of the expeditions as he could. Because the Chinese don't go, traditionally, Chinese does not go outward. There's no point doing this, everything is here. So it's because China differed symbolically from the West that it did not come to dominate the world, not because it had inferior technology or less wealth. Europeans were extremely poor with very crude technology and still came to dominate the world. So the Chinese were dominated by this concentric worldview, and while all other cultures enforce conformity, the West slowly, Galileo did spend the latter part of his life under house arrest, but more and more the individual was freed to exercise their own individual imaginations. So when you download this slide, you might want to go through here and say, who are these people? Artists, scientists, artists, writers, scientists, industrialists, and just plain lunatic geniuses. And see if you can figure out who they are. But no other culture would have permitted the emergence of these figures, which is what the difference was between these cultures. Now, what I describe today is traditionalism. In other words, this sort of an essentialist traditional picture of China, India, Japan. Is this true for today? So here's one little thought. Obviously, China is very, advanced, scientifically involved, etc. But here's a little thought for you. This is a book by the president of China. Today, he writes, Chinese have always developed their country through studying the nature of things, correcting thoughts with sincerity, cultivating the moral self, managing the family, and safeguarding peace under heaven. So this sort of reflects some of the ideas we were looking at over the past several hundred years, reflected in China right now. And we might ask of Japan, has Japan westernized or modernized? Japan's a totally modern, wealthy country. How would you describe that? And I'm not going to give an answer, it's something to think about. But recall this Shintoism, veneration of the kami, or spirits. And one of the great Japanese filmmakers, Miyazaki, makes movies, very famous one, Princess Monocle, about these kami or spirits. Now, what do they look like? If you'd ask any Japanese 40 years ago what these spirits looked like, there would no answer. They were it's just something in their past. And Miyazaki has revived them and given them a contemporary manifestation, and they're very much, again, in the Japanese imagination. So just something to think about. Now, I'm going to end with my approach is symbolic, metaphorical, and essentialist, that there are these qualities and things. Essentialism is very not current in sociological and political thought. I refer to two texts. One is Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West, and then Joseph Campbell's The Masks of God, very influential in my approach. We are very dominated today by a materialist approach, which you'll find in Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, and a very prominent architect on our faculty here at Pratt, Miguel de Landa, 1,000 Years of Non-Linear History. So you can think about, what approach makes sense to you.